So, if it isn't noticeable, I'm now using my new camera. You might be able to tell from the frame rate or like the quality. I'm not entirely certain. I'm currently looking at the very tiny screen next to it. But for this video, I have to thank my sister for sending me down this rabbit hole in which I've literally become that crazy guy with the red string. One day, whilst I was making dinner, my sister asked me, did the other Peters forget that they were Peter Parker when they got back to their home dimensions? I said, no, it wouldn't work because the spell wasn't really designed to like affect Peter Parker at all. It won't affect any Peter Parker, just everyone that's around him that knows of him, right? But it did get me thinking a lot. And I believe that the final spell that Doctor Strange casts in No Way Home takes a massive effect on not just his world with the MCU, but completely rewrites the timeline of both Tobey's and Andrew's Spider-Man. Now, I know that is a big claim that people would immediately jump to the comment section for, but of course I will explain. So we're going to cut to the whiteboard, and hopefully I'm not going to sound like a madman while I explain it, but I'm pretty sure I will. Right, so I haven't used this in a long while in a video, but it's the best way I can explain what I'm trying to explain without sounding insane. I mean, I might still look insane, but now at least I'll have visual ramblings to be insane about as well. Before I get into the meat of the theory, I have to first explain the bones of the theory to actually, get the meat on it. And that's how I personally view the Marvel multiverse and like how it works. So firstly, we're going to make a spray of dots, right? Just dots everywhere around. We're going to imagine that each of these, actually, how well does that pick up on camera? You can partially see it. We're going to say that each of these dots is, an alternate dimension. Each of them is their own Earth and universe. And of course, each of them have their own art style. So we'll split it into quadrants because that's the best way I can explain it. We have the comic book art style, we have the video game style, and we have the animated stuff, right? And that means we also have the live action dimensions. So, of course, the multiverse is split up into these things. It isn't exactly sorted like the quadrants you see here. It's probably really messy, but still they would fall into some kind of alignment along these quadrants. So now that we understand that, I can get into the way you can perceive the dimensions exactly. So, of course, a normal dimension, if you were to perceive it from its just current point in time, it's just dot, right? That's just a dimension. But if you were to view a dimension from its start to its finish point, it would be a line, which, is a timeline. So this whole dimension is a timeline. My hair is slowly becoming more and more frayed as I explain this. So, of course, if you were to look at that previous multiverse map that we just drew, it would just be a whole bunch of lines near each other. They might be intersecting each other because they have the same events happening in them, but generally it would be a whole bunch of strings. Now, obviously Marvel has actually already done this and shown this way of the representation of the Marvel multiverse through the Loki TV series by representing the multiverse as those strands that Loki holds on to, right? So now that you understand that there is a singular focus point of a multiverse being a dot, and the full timeline of a multiverse being a line, we'll use those for me to continue my explanation. So in the movie No Way Home, there is a multiversal bleed that, it visually will look something along the lines of dot here, circle, and circle. Now the way that this happens is because Doctor Strange casts a spell. Originally it was meant to wipe the memory of everyone knowing Peter Parker as Spider-Man, but Peter kept messing with it, and so it came out funny, and the multiverse started opening up to it. And so initially when it happens, this point in time is the MCU, right? So it's only one focal point in time. But then the entirety of a timelines of the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movie and the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movie open up to the MCU. I know I sound insane. Just keep up with me. Now, of course, that means that it's opened this bridge up that allowed the villains of both movies to come through. So you would have the Green Goblin that came through. You would have the Dr. Octavius, and you would have Sandman from Tobey Maguire. But then from Andrew Garfield, you would have the Lizard and Electro, right? So they all went from these multiple different points in the timelines of their dimensions to go into this one singular point of just this one present time in the MCU dimension. Now, of course, when that happens and the villains and the Spider-Men come through the dimension, Doctor Strange stops it. Oh, my script stopped. Doctor Strange stops it from growing out into the further multiverse, because for some reason the closest multiversal worlds that were near the MCU were the Andrew Garfield one and the Tobey Maguire one. Don't know why, but they were, and that's why they were the first ones that were able to interact with the MCU world. But of course, Doctor Strange contains it, you know, in that big cube. He contains the spell, and throughout the whole movie is the idea of either pressing the button, which will then erase the spell, which would erase the connections, and in turn send everyone back home to potentially get, you know, ended, or alternatively, they heal them and send them back home, although a lot of people have debated that if they were to do that, they might still get ended, but that's not what this theory is about. But of course, it's not like they got pulled in one at a time based on the timeline, like it was just going over time. It was just pulling them at random, because when the spell was cast, it was looking for people who knew Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and it found these two dimensions and started pulling again everyone who knew he was Spider-Man into it. One thing I was confused by was, I don't think Sandman, like Flint Marko, ever actually knew he was Peter Parker. He saw his face, but I don't think he knew he was Peter Parker. I might be wrong. I did rewatch the movie, so I'll be kind of disappointed if he did, and I just completely mentally skipped over it. But yes, to visualize the whole event, this is what it looks like with the spell contained within the cube, and this is how it looks like with the multiple dimensions interacting with the MCU dimension, right? But of course, eventually, the spell is released by the Green Goblin near the end of the movie, and the spell is released. So then the spell does what it was doing before with the, you know, the whole splitting open the multiverse. So these two worlds are now fully opened. The gates reopen to these dimensions, and it starts looking for other dimensions outside of it to pull people into from. Because, you know, it would start... we'll look at the galaxy map again of the multiverse, right? Let's say the galaxy map here, I don't know if you guys can see those dots again. We say that these are the galaxy maps, that's the MCU. It's like an explosion going outwards from the central point, and it'll just keep going and going until, I don't know what happens, it implodes on itself. That's usually how these things work. But yeah, it starts dragging, it attempts to drag in other people from other universes. And so Doctor Strange then casts a spell at Peter's demand, or I don't know what the right terminology would be. He gets him to cast a spell that makes everyone forget that Peter Parker even existed outright. Now, of course, when the spell is casted in the... We'll raise this real quick so I can actually visually explain it again. So when the spell is cast, we'll say that this is the line of the MCU, right? We'll put two lines there. One represents Spider-Man's interaction, one shows off Peter Parker's interactions. So when he makes that spell, we'll say that it happened around here. Everything back here, the actions still happen. So let's say that these lines are Peter Parker's actions. It's just that no one remembers how those actions exactly happened or who made those actions. So little bits of Peter Parker get erased, except, you know, he still exists, and his actions still exist in the MCU because it was made from just this point. Everything but that he did beforehand still exists. And of course, Spider-Man isn't affected by this at all because Spider-Man is, you know, Spider-Man. He's not Peter Parker. But then when he made this wish, as I said before, the gates to the multiverse were open again. And so the spell not only affected the MCU, the whole point is that it was meant to affect the multiverse, right? It's meant to go out into the multiverse, meant to make all these people who are trying to come in forget that Peter Parker even exists, right? That's already going to do a lot of damage to random dimensions if what I'm about to get into doesn't already happen. So when the spell is cast, it only affects like the memory of people and some like actual documents in the MCU. But since this spell like reached the entire timeline of the other two dimensions from start to end, it means that when Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man were even born in their timelines, they immediately got erased. So like as soon as Mother Parker and Father Parker have little baby Peter Parker, they immediately forget that he exists. The nurses forget that he exists. Anyone that learnt the name or looked at the face of Peter Parker, even when he was freshly born, immediately forgot that he exists. Which is messed up. And you would probably imply that the Peter Parker wouldn't live long enough to continue his life. And so then eventually, later on, the two Peter Parkers that were on the MCU Earth would return to these timelines in which they now never existed. Because the original effect happening at the start of the timeline means that Peter Parker and potentially Spider-Man from those two timelines have been completely erased. So they're going back to timelines and Earths where they just never existed, neither as Peter Parker or Spider-Man, because of the spell. Now, I don't know if I explained it quite properly. What I'm saying is that the MCU Earth is rooted in one piece of time. It won't affect the MCU's timeline because it's only being cast at that one point in time. But since the entire timelines of the other two dimensions are entirely open, which is why the Green Goblin, who had already perished, was able to come through, the entire timeline is open, point from start to end. So the entirety of Spider-Man and Peter Parker's, the entirety of Peter Parker is erased from memory within that timeline. I'm getting kind of rambly. I'm just hoping that you guys kind of understand what I'm trying to explain. So yeah, it erases the memory of Peter from the MCU, but doesn't actually physically erase him. But since it's erasing the knowledge of Peter at the start of his very existence in the other two dimensions, it might as well have erased him physically too, because everyone forgets about him off the bat as soon as he is born, for both the parents and both the dimensions. So what I'm trying to say is, I've written it down here when I was writing the script. I'm hoping this sounds a little more sane. So what I'm trying to say is that due to the way the dimensions had been opened up to the MCU and the type of spell that had been cast, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man would be returning to a world where they never existed from birth. You know, how different would these worlds be? What would these dimensions be like without their Peter Parkers or their Spider-Mans? And I will explain it to you once I get back in the chair. And I'm sorry if this didn't make much sense. I just knew that I couldn't explain this verbally without having some kind of visual, because if I did, I would just sound insane.
I rewatched the Spider-Man movies, pretty much all of the original ones with Tobey Maguire and then the Andrew Garfield amazing ones, right? And being able to watch them, like one of my favorite characters as a work thing, is actually really cool. But I will say that when I bought the ultra high definition version digitally on YouTube, I was kind of expecting to be able to watch it in ultra high definition and not 480p. I'm assuming it's when I watch it on other platforms, but why is it 480p on my browser? I bought the ultra high definition version. I'd hate to know what the low quality version is. We'll start off looking at Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man's universe, right? Or dimension, or whatever term you might want to use. Obviously, the first major change would be that he would never meet Mary Jane when he's 6, where he claims that she looks like an angel or something along the lines of that. So yeah, he never met her. And Aunt May and Uncle Ben wouldn't be raising a kid, so they might be better off financially as they won't have to pay for a child as well as themselves. Although I do believe that Aunt May and Uncle Ben would still get to know their new neighbors more in depth without having to care for a child, because they would care for Peter, so they can't really pay too much attention to the next door neighbors like drama. And because of that, that means that they eventually might just cave in on themselves and help Mary Jane's mother split things off with the abusive father that's in the family. Of course, Uncle Ben would be like, that's not very manlike. You shouldn't be doing these things. And he'd be like, bugger off. I imagine that Mary Jane would then have a divorced parent much earlier on, because I'm pretty sure it happens in the movie anyway, but that's just later on. And so I believe that Mary Jane might have Uncle Ben and Aunt May kind of develop kind of like these like step uncle and aunts situation. I don't know if that's the right term. It would be kind of like an adoptive uncle and aunt, except they aren't actually genetically related, and she probably won't have as deep of a connection with them as Peter did to them as well. Now, on the Osborn side, Harry would have never met Peter, and in turn, Norman would have never seen Peter as a second son to lean on and, like, kind of compared to Harry. It would also mean that Harry would probably stay in private schools, which I feel like Norman Osborn would actually prefer, obviously. Of course, we skip ahead a few years to the certain science school trip, which is where the iconic moment of him becoming Spider-Man happens. The only characters we know of actually being there are Flash Thompson and Mary Jane. Now, in the film, Mary Jane tends to launder near the spider display even after the rest of the group has wandered off. So if anyone was realistically still going to be bit by the spider, it was probably going to be Mary Jane. So that's our first like timeline split. One world where Mary Jane is bit, and one where literally no one is bit by a spider. I imagine that Mary Jane wouldn't really put her new superpowers to use immediately, other than potentially scaring her abusive father away if it wasn't already previously done. She'd probably try continue her life as normal, in all honesty, because she wouldn't want to have to deal with these powers getting in the way of what she wants to be, which was an actress. Or she might use them towards becoming an actress, who knows. But there's one thing about the Raimi universe that'll happen whether or not Peter exists, is that the Green Goblin will still be created, no matter what. Well, unless Norman Osborn gets off before he does it. But nonetheless, you see Norman Osborn's transformation into the Green Goblin in the movie had literally nothing to do with Peter or Spider-Man. He self-tested the super soldier formula, which caused his mental instability, and the attempted removal of him from the board is what causes him to attack Times Square, where the board members were at. Oh, and of course, Uncle Ben never dies. The reason for it in the film was because he was waiting for Peter outside the library, thinking that he was there, but with no Peter, Uncle Ben would have never waited outside the library. That also means that the New York Wrestling League still gets robbed, and this time the robber probably gets away with Flint Marko in a car that was jacked without casualty this time, and it would have just been labeled another robbery in New York City. But now we go back to the Goblin attack in Times Square, and I believe that Harry would have still been on the balcony with the rest of the higher-ups at Oscorp, and Mary Jane is probably somewhere in the crowd down below enjoying the celebration. In the movie, she would be up there with Harry as there's a weird relationship thing going on, but, she's not going to be there in this case scenario. I imagine that Norman would obviously still attack the Oscorp board, but he's unintentionally endangered his son, and he's aware of that, so he would grab him before leaving the scene, which would make people think that the Green Goblin just kidnapped the son of a CEO. And you see, that's the exact point where Spider-Man would have stopped him from snatching Mary Jane, I think, and they would have fought, which was where Green Goblin saw Spider-Man and was like, I'm going to make you my rival. But again, it didn't happen because, Peter wasn't there, nor was Spider-Man. So Norman fulfilled his goal of taking out the board and, just bolted. But the casualties to the event were still pretty numerous. There would be around 10 to 15 casualties, including the people on the balcony and the people below the balcony, which the debris fell down from. And I feel like that event in itself is what probably would have caused Mary Jane to become Spider-Woman, because she would have seen all this death and all this destruction. It would have gone, I'm going to get that guy. What the hell? If I'm capable of doing it, I should do it. Because I imagine that she might have still learnt I imagine that she would have still learnt the mantra that Peter did. And when Uncle Ben was probably potentially being like, adoptive uncle, he would have been like, you got some decent acting power in you. You got to use that responsibly. Something along the lines of that. I don't know. Now, in this universe, again, assuming that Norman's relationship with Harry is strong enough, I believe that there would be a few different outcomes. My hopeful assumption is that Harry tries to get his father help, after learning that he's the Goblin. His dad probably doesn't have any more goals as the Goblin other than, absolute power and becoming even more powerful than the CEO of Oscorp or whatever. And so Harry tries to cure his father, either be through an actual medicinal thing, making another serum, or through actual mental health stuff, because Harry he cares for his father more in this, and his father cares for him more in this, so he'd be more willing to help him. Although eventually, somehow, I'm assuming Mary Jane's Spider-Woman would find him, and that would come to 3 different conclusions. One of them, she would stand down, properly understanding the situation, and plays guard dog for the potential Goblin resurface, in case, he just snaps out of nowhere and starts going ham on everyone. She would turn around and try and take him out. But in this case scenario, she's not trying to antagonize him, she's just standing back, watching. Then Norman gets cured, quote unquote, to some extent, and goes to a psychiatric institution as a way to punish him for his crimes while still attempting to rehabilitate him. I call this the Gold Goblin timeline, as I feel like Harry may attempt to finish his father's work on the serum for the super soldiers and use the serum on himself for a good reason and not distribute it to the military, becoming a more heroic goblin, which in the comic books, as of more recently, was actually called the Gold Goblin. Alternatively, Harry's attempt to cure Norman could go wrong, and Norman either convinces Harry to join him, or infects him with the Goblin Serum somehow. Somehow he's just turning Harry to the dark side. Either way, there would be 2 goblins. With a lack of experience and fighting 2-1, I believe that the new Spider-Woman will probably be defeated by the 2 of them, and will be in a
Goblin King timeline, where Green Goblin takes over everything, and this is like the worst case scenario. And finally, we have a timeline that most aligns with the original film's plot. Mary Jane Spider-Woman unintentionally eggs on Norman, causing the two to clash, with Harry becoming angry at the interruption of him trying to like cure his father. The events still happen, with Spider-Man supposedly ending the Green Goblin, albeit unintentionally, or Green Goblin doing it to himself, and Harry blames her for his father's death. But he still understands that his father wasn't really a good person, but, you know, he still can be mad nonetheless because he was still trying to help him, and she ruined it. But for the sake of being able to continue on to the next movie, we'll say that either the Gold Goblin or the near original timeline happened, as the Goblin King timeline would just completely change things and probably end it off right there. In Spider-Man 2, we go up against Doc Ock. The event of his creation was due to his experiment gone wrong. Now, that event in general could have multiple outcomes depending on what Mary Jane has done as Spider-Woman. We'll say that she's been fighting crime for a while after the first movie, so she's better trained and might be struggling money-wise, as she can't keep a job as she has to keep being Spider-Woman. She might eventually even fall into the same photography job that Peter had, where she just takes photos of herself as Spider-Woman and they post it up in the Daily Bugle. And now this is where I'm going to stretch it a bit and say that hopefully she has the task of taking pictures of Otto's new experiment, as the only person who actually stops the event from happening in the main movie was Spider-Man. Alternatively, if she isn't actively at the experiment, I would hope that she's swinging nearby and a spider sense goes off for her to stop it. Because if that experiment fails and there is no spider person or anyone that's capable of stopping it, maybe even like a Gold Goblin Harry just jumping on the disconnect before like he gets smacked in the side of the head by like railing or whatever happened to him in the movie. If no one stops it, the device will pull in both Otto and probably Harry, and then it'll pull in the device that's controlling it and keeping it stable as well. So then it would probably collapse in on itself immediately after sucking everything in and explode, wiping out probably not only the building, probably the city block, in all honesty. Which would mean that Doc Ock and Harry would just be taken off the board immediately, and if there was a Spider-Woman and she wasn't there to stop it, there wouldn't be a Doc Ock, and there probably wouldn't be a future new Goblin, which would solve the issue, but it would also stop it right there. But also for the sake of continuity, we'll say she was there taking photos, or she swung in. But this is where she would meet Harry for the first time as Mary Jane if she was taking photos. Now, whether or not this is the Gold Goblin Harry or the new original Harry matters a bit, as he may be more willing to jump into action, as I said before. Nonetheless, Doc Ock is still made, and he starts to build a second sun power machine. Now, if it's Vengeful Harry from the near original timeline, then the plot is nearly the same as the actual movie, minus the damsel in distress thing and all that. But if it's the Gold Goblin Harry, I believe he would work alongside Spider-Woman to take Doc Ock down gently before he can build the fully working second sun machine, and probably cure him of his AI arm thing as well. Because he's the only one who has, like, the tritium, I think it was called tritium, to make that, like, sun power thing. So Harry has, like, a monopoly against him to be able to bring him wherever he wants for Spider-Man and, Spider-Woman and Gold Goblin to take him out. Or, alternatively, Spider-Woman is taken down and Doc Ock makes the second device without interruption, probably wiping out half of New York as well. Or if it's the King Goblin timeline, none of this would have even happened. But now we step into the Spider-Man 3 movie timeline, where a lot of changes will be taking place because a lot happens in this movie. If Harry is still the near original version of himself, the one that's still petty about Spider-Man taking out his father and all that, he would become the new Green Goblin and try and take down Spider-Woman. Or if he's the Gold Goblin version of himself, he might actually be in a relationship with Mary Jane, as I would imagine they would reveal each other's identities to each other at some point, and they might fall in love, as they still partially did do that in the actual original movies. I know it's very fan-fiction-y, but I'm doing my best to make this end up as like the good timeline. Now, for the other villains, we wouldn't have a Sandman outright in general. I believe with the successful robbery of the New York Wrestling League, and Uncle Ben, hasn't been ended, Flint Marko makes it away with the cash and gets to be a free criminal. Using the cash, he gets his daughter help. That was the whole point of doing it, and goes back to a normal job after that to ensure he can still sustain the family stuff. He would never speak of the robbery again to ensure he hides himself. So in turn, he never goes to prison and never escapes, never getting turned to sand. As for Venom,
I'm entirely uncertain about what would happen to the alien symbiote. You see, no matter the change, he'll still end up in Central Park through the asteroid. Now, he just won't have a scooter to latch onto to find Peter, because Peter and Mary Jane would have never gone on that date in the park. Meaning he could just end up perishing in the park because he would have lacked a host, or he might start jumping from the wildlife till he finds a human being. But I honestly wouldn't know what the outcome would be because there's too many rogue variables for this rogue Venom. I did kind of make like a very, very fan-fiction-y outcome for it though. You see, in Spider-Man 3, J. Jonah Jameson wanted photos of Spider-Man doing something sketchy and used it as a competition for Eddie Brock and Peter Parker to compete against each other for like a proper permanent job in the Daily Bugle. But now in our altered timeline, they have to get a photo of Spider-Woman doing something sketchy. But at this time, she would never get the Venom symbiote, so it'd be less likely for her to be caught doing something sketchy, or even photoshopped into doing that. So my idea is that a homeless woman would find the Venom symbiote, and she would use it to pretend to be Spider-Woman while robbing places, because she would want to have riches for once in her life. Eddie could then legitimately get his job to some extent, because it wouldn't actually be Spider-Woman doing the sketchy stuff, but it would still be a photo of Spider-Woman doing something sketchy. And eventually that woman who had the Venom symbiote could turn into just a normal thief. The name of this woman I'm thinking of could be Felicia Hardy. Now, that is why it is more fanfiction-y, because in the Raimi universe, I don't actually think there is an official, like, Felicia Hardy for there to even have this thing going on. So the outcomes for that movie would just be the Gold Goblin and Spider-Woman potentially fighting some random venomized person, or Spider-Woman just beefing with the new Green Goblin, which would have still been the same movie before, but now just minus 2 villains. Although a wild alternative reality would be the King Goblin world, but now Green Goblin is venomized as like the Venom King Goblin. That would be kind of badass. He just needs a better name. Like a Dark Lord Goblin, that would go so hard. And so you have to think about this. The future Peter, the one from the Tobey Maguire universe, Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker, would have just left his world as Peter Parker, who was married to Mary Jane, and now probably retiring as Spider-Man to help out the MCU Peter Parker. But then he comes back to find that not only did he never exist, his wife is now Spider-Woman and may or may not be married to Harry Osborn for a long period of time. Oh, and Harry is alive in the first place, and so is Norman, and so is Doc Ock. And then he learns that Aunt May and Uncle Ben were alive for a longer period of time. Because I imagine that at this point in time, when he did come to the MCU, that Aunt May and Uncle Ben had, Aunt May had, passed on because of age, but learning that Uncle Ben lived as well would have been wild. They might believe that he's from some weird alternative time, not realizing that the timeline that he's currently standing in was originally his timeline, if he displayed his powers. But, it would never be the same. It's like an irreparable amount of damage. Alternatively, he could be going to a world where the Goblin has taken over everything, or a world where half the city is a crater. All I know is that it would make the most sense for Peter to probably take on the Last Stand suit, which would be cool, and become a rigid, grumpy old Peter Parker in a world where, he never existed. And he was injured when he came back, by the way. That he's going to be injured looking at all this and go like, what the hell happened? Where's my wife? Now, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man gets it so much worse. At least for him. You see, if Peter was forgotten right after birth in the Amazing Spider-Man universe, just like the Raimi Peter was, his parents would still, perish in the plane crash as they made those actions outside of Peter in the first place. But Aunt May and Uncle Ben wouldn't have to raise him. The secrets of his father left behind would, stay hidden, and Gwen would have never met him. Flash Thompson might still be a bully. I'm not sure if the death of Uncle Ben really made him softer on Peter. I'm pretty sure that it might have. So I'm assuming that without Peter and without the death of Uncle Ben, Flash Thompson might still be a bit of a bully. Peter would never be friends with Harry, again in this universe as well, because he would have never met him. And no one would be bit by the spider, as in the Amazing Spider-Man movie, you had to specifically go into this one room that is permanently locked, and everyone else that goes into there wears a suit to ensure they don't get bitten by these spiders, because if anyone else gets bitten by those spiders, that's it for them. If Peter gets bitten by it, he turns into Spider-Man, because it's all genetic based in that movie. But because of that, Dr. Connors would also never finish his serum, because he got help from Peter to finish the serum in the movie. And the Lizard, the main villain of the movie, would never exist. It would be another Tuesday for New Yorkers. And Uncle Ben, again, he wouldn't have died. at all. He would just grow old with Aunt May. And due to Dr. Connor's experiment not even like doing anything, they would have destroyed all the research for it, including the spiders and all that, although they still keep the spider venom because they always do that apparently. Then in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 movie, I imagine the plutonium heist that you would see at the start of it, which Spider-Man stops, would still happen. And in turn, the carnage of like cars flying everywhere would still happen too. It just means that no one's there to stop a man from collecting blueprints off of the middle of the road that he had dropped. Said man being Max, the guy who becomes Electro. You see, Max gets wiped off the board really early on by a rogue flying car because Spider-Man isn't there to catch it. And there you go, like boom, half the movie is just gone. And then you have Harry. He's the only wild card, I would say, as he might still go crazy. You see, after the passing of Norman Osborn, Harry gets the company at the age of 20 and is made aware that he has this goblin sickness that his father had had. And the Oscorp board doesn't want Harry to control the company in any kind of way because he's 20 years old. They don't think he's going to be able to control it responsibly. So inevitably, I imagine he goes searching for a cure with the little, like, information puck that his father gave him. And he accidentally opens up a file that Felicia told him to look for the spider venom. And again, they would have planted evidence in there, labeled under him, and been like, oh, Harry Osborn's been doing some sketchy stuff in our company already. We need to kick him out, get him arrested, or something along the lines of that. Kick him out of the Oscorp board. And then, because he's been kicked out, he doesn't actually have Electro this time to try and get his company back. Or the spider venom to cure himself. Quote unquote cure, by the way. He probably just passes on from the goblin sickness like his father did, except it was like much more aggressive for him for some reason. Now, of course, I have been avoiding the topic of Gwen generally because realistically, she would just go to Oxford and get her scholarship in England and live her life like normal. You know how messed up that would be for Andrew's Peter to come back to a world which was better off without him or Spider-Man. You know, crime would still be at a normal level. It wouldn't have been lowered. And some deaths would happen that Spider-Man wouldn't have stopped. And that one kid, I think his name was Jorge, would still get bullied for a school project or whatever. But Uncle Ben and Aunt May would live to become old. And Captain Stacy would live, and Gwen Stacy would live, and no supervillains ever get created. Like, all of that would just never happen. He would be coming back from a win, potentially getting over his trauma a bit after saving the Mary Jane or the MJ from the MCU, and see a world where Gwen's alive, his uncle and his aunt are alive, and they're growing old together. You know, everything. No villains. And, like, Oscorp is probably, like, still, like, a dirty company, but, like, that's the only negative other than a few, like, you know, deaths that he wouldn't have stopped as Spider-Man. I nearly said Superman. Just to learn that the reason all of this didn't happen was because he was never there. Or Spider-Man was never there. At least Tobey could continue being Spider-Man, but the Amazing Spider-Man Peter would probably feel so defeated that he never would put the mask on again, because it would be like, he would think that it would be a detriment to be a superhero again. But, you know, there is the good news. He gets to have a second chance at being with Gwen Stacy, which is really sweet. That is, if he can get over the whole seeing her lifeless body in his arms thing. But of course, this was just me spiraling of theorizing, and it all just came from one question. By no means is any of this considered canon. Am I not saying this is canon? It would be neat if it was. In fact, one might say that Doctor Strange gently closed the dimensional gates before casting the spell, in turn meaning that no changes would have happened at all to their dimensions. But it is neat to think about how much this would have changed if the spell did actually affect not only their points in times, but their entire timelines. You could still think of it as a neat thing if it didn't affect their timelines, and it just affected what they came back to. But nonetheless, although I don't actually think it would do much for Andrew Garfield, at most I think Aunt May might forget that he's Spider-Man, because that's the only other person I can think of who knew it. What else would be neat is if you leave your theories down in the comment section. I would love to hear what others may think would happen if this spell had actually gotten loose into the multiverse, or just some theories on the new Spider-Man movie actually coming out, as Peter would be dealing with these spell's consequences through that, alongside, hopefully, a more street-level threat. Although Hulk is apparently in it, so my hopes are a little wavered about it, but I'm hoping they do something that they did in the comic books, where Bruce Banner did forget that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and in this case he would forget about Peter Parker, but the Hulk still remembered Peter, although I'm pretty sure the Hulk
never actually met Peter, because the Hulk was in space when Peter first showed up, and then by the time that Peter got snapped back into reality after being snapped out of it, the Hulk had become Smart Hulk. Although he probably would have learnt it through Tony. Nonetheless, but yeah, if you liked this horrifying ramble, feel free to subscribe, and while you're down there, you may as well like the video as well, as it pushes it into the algorithm for others to see. Also, if you like this camera, let me know. Well, I'm still working on how to get it to work. I'm not sure how good its like focusing is in general. It looks pretty good though. And as always, not sponsored. Thanks to all my members, TeaInAButtercup, Crystal Kensbit, Jasmine Wilson, Wilbur Flight, and Nugsy1. I'll see you all again next week.